very possibly idea what you were
Yeah.
But the other thing is, Emma, did you bring another thing of water? Okay, well, there's one in there. This is the last one. No, I don't think you need to bring it. I'm gonna catch it. I won't.
There's a whole new one.
I know. When I go to, Costco, I'll just go. I don't think it matters. I don't think it does. We had a lot more water 2 weeks ago.
See, all the meddling, and so that Asian probably came out and did this, whatever, probably washed her face for this. Anyway. And I, as soon as I got back in my door, I'm supposed to.
I got the arrow. Is it too cold?
She said she felt the breeze.
Oh.
So I'm anxious to hear how they have a time anyway.
I was sitting there going,
There's no feeling, but I had to pay.
Always person later.
I do.
And so I just asked for a couple of
I think that water might have been from the reception they had last week.
oh, could be. I don't know. I just asked for forgiveness.
I was able to pass them on to hold on to it when I first thing.
Are we ready?
The reason why I wanted to get it so quickly. Oh, so the order.
Kenny?
I don't know. I'm looking to see if he's pulling it up.
Doors open.
They weren't.
Okay, we're gonna get started.
This is short though. Richard said it was long.
What's that?
Richard, he told me. This is scary when I start reading.
And before we're busy, but can you give me the name or an author for the autobiography of Pat St. Pat?
Jeff?
No, it's not St. Pat, the autobiography of Santa Claus.
Santa Claus.
There's a mention of Patrick in there.
I think you were talking about St. Pat.
Oh, did you hear what the preacher said about St. Pat? That was none.
Okay, never mind, don't worry about it.
You don't need the
I
autobiography of
never
Santa
thought
Claus?
of it as
Because I
human
heard that about.
trafficking. I knew he was a prisoner.
Yeah.
Okay, anyway, we'll get into that.
Okay.
Okay.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay. This,
We're early.
I know. Ooh, you're gonna mess everything up. Okay, my kitties. Let's do it. This is one of those pivotal lessons. And I didn't realize it until I did it. But really, I've been showing this slide every week. And none of you have been. Okay. This lesson ties in everything together. Believe it or not, this lesson is going to tie it all in together. And this is what we've got left in the Old Testament. So basically, we got 4 weeks, and then we take off for Easter. When we come back from Easter, we're into the New Testament. So if you go back to this, we've gone through the garden. We have been in this story of Israel. And the story of Israel is about to wrap up. I mean, because, and you'll see. Then we get into Jesus, the church, and the new garden. Well, everything is going to tie together, I hope, pretty well this week. So we got these left, basically Civil War, the kingdom's falling, the exile, and then the return. The return.
And when you say pivotal, are you saying pivotal to the whole word, the
Yes.
whole body, the whole?
This is going to tie together and look forward. And it's going to be, I hope, very interesting. And I'm going to teach this in 2 parts, okay? The first part is the life of Solomon. And that's what you read today, okay? That's what you read today. And then what we're going to take a look at, because it's one of those things, when I got to my fun part of basically prophecy, you bring in the temple. Because the beginning, what we had in the wilderness was the tabernacle, which was really a mobile temple, all right? And with it's a mobile temple. and now with Solomon building the temple, we get all of this beginning, almost genesis, of where this temple fits in across everything. So basically what I'm going to do is bring in a bunch of prophecy around the temple that look forward to basically the end of Israel, the end of the story of Israel, the beginning of the gospel, the beginning of the church, and the end. All right? It all ties in with this temple. So we're going to watch we're going to watch two videos, one on Kings and one then on Chronicles. So what you're going to get with Kings is version is all of Solomon, and then what we're going to do over the next 2 weeks. All right? And then when we get into Chronicles, we'll talk about that in a second. So sit back, relax, and we're going to enjoy the...
Hey, Chris, we just finished First and Second Chronicles in our daily Bible reading.
Did you really?
Yeah, Emma and I have been saying it's been reinforcing and yeah, that was where it was.
We're in Revelation.
Yeah, now we just started Revelation, but we had Chronicles like all.
Well, you're going to get to Revelations tonight, too.
I know. I mean, it's
So,
crazy.
all right, you sit back,
Okay.
get your popcorn, here we go.
Anybody need popcorn?
The books of 1st and 2nd Kings. Although they're two separate books in our Bibles, they were originally written as one book telling a unified story that continues on from the book of Samuel that came before it. So David has unified the tribes of Israel into a kingdom, and God promised that from his line would come a messianic king who would establish God's kingdom over the nations and fulfill the promises made to Abraham. So the book of Kings tells the story of the long line of kings that came after David, and none of them lived up to that promise. In fact, they run the nation of Israel right into the ground. The book is designed to have 5 main movements. The story begins and ends focused on Jerusalem. First with Solomon's reign and the construction of the temple, and then in this last section ending with Jerusalem's destruction and Israel's exile to Babylon. And the story leading up to this tragedy is what makes up the center 3 sections, which explain how Israel split into 2 rival kingdoms, how God tried to prevent the corruption of Israel by sending the prophets, and how exile became the unavoidable consequence of Israel's sin. The book opens with 2 chapters about the kingdom passing from the aging David to his son Solomon. And David's final words to Solomon are very similar to those of Moses and Joshua and Samuel to the people. It's a call to remain faithful to the commands of the covenant and to give allegiance to the God of Israel alone. But David's words ring somewhat hollow here, because David and Solomon then go on to conspire how they're going to consolidate this new kingdom through a whole series of political assassinations. It's not off to a great start. Solomon's brightest moment comes when he asks God for wisdom to lead Israel. And he even completes David's dream to make a temple for the God of Israel. Here the story actually stops and describes the design of this temple in detail, just like the tabernacle design in the Torah. There's all these gold and jewels and depictions of angels and fruit trees. It's all symbolism echoing back to the Garden of Eden. It's the place where heaven and earth meet, where God's presence dwells with his people. But no sooner does Solomon finish the temple than he makes some really horrible choices, and the kingdom falls apart. He starts marrying the daughters of other kings, hundreds of them, for political alliances. And then he adopts their gods and introduces the worship of those gods into Israel. Solomon then accumulates huge amounts of wealth. He builds a huge army. He even institutes slave labor for all of his building projects. Now, if you go back to the Torah and look at God's guidelines for Israel's kings in Deuteronomy 17, Solomon is breaking every one. So by the time that he dies, Solomon resembles Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, more than he does his father David. The next section of the book opens with Solomon's son, Rehoboam, acting just like his father. It's a very sad story of greed and lust for power. He tries to increase taxes for slave labor. And under the leadership of Jeroboam, the northern tribes reject this, they rebel and secede, and form their own rival kingdom. And so now in the story, you have the southern kingdom, Judah, centered in Jerusalem, with kings from the line of David, and now this new northern kingdom called Israel, whose capital will be Samaria eventually. Jeroboam also goes on to build 2 new temples to compete with Solomon's temple in the south. He puts a golden calf in each one to represent the God of Israel. The connection to Exodus 32 and the golden calf, it's all quite explicit. From this point on, the story goes back and forth from north to south, tracing the fate of both kingdoms. Each one had about 20 successive kings, and as the author introduces each king, he evaluates their reign by a few criteria. Did they worship the God of Israel alone, or did they promote the worship of other gods? Did they deal with idolatry among the people? And did they remain faithful to the covenant like David, or do they become corrupt and unjust? And according to these criteria, the author finds no good kings in northern Israel, 0 for 20. And then in southern Judah, only 8 out of 20 get a positive rating, which connects to another huge purpose in this book, and that's to introduce the role of the prophets, key figures in Israel's history. So in the Bible, prophets were not fortune tellers. Rather, they spoke on behalf of the God of Israel, and they played the role of covenant watchdogs, which means they called out idolatry and injustice among the kings and the people. They were constantly reminding Israel of their calling to be a light to the nations, that they should obey the commands of the Torah, and so the prophets challenged Israel to repent and follow their God. In these center sections for each king, God then raises up prophets to hold them accountable. The most prominent prophets are the northern ones, Elijah and his disciple Elisha, right here in the center of the book. Elijah was a wild man of a prophet living out in the desert, and his arch nemesis was the northern king Ahab and his Canaanite wife Jezebel. Together, these two had instituted the worship of the Canaanite god Baal over Israel. And so in a famous story, Elijah challenged 450 prophets of Baal to a contest to see which god was real. So they both built altars and prayed to their gods, but only the God of Israel answers with fire. After this, Ahab uses his royal power to murder an Israelite farmer and then steal his family's vineyard. And Elijah again confronts Ahab's injustice, and he announces the downfall of his house. Elijah eventually passes the mantle of his prophetic leadership to a young disciple named Elisha, who asks for 2 times the authority of Elijah. And what's fascinating here is how the author, he's recounted 7 miraculous feats for Elijah, and then he offers stories of 14 acts of power from Elisha. Both prophets were clearly remarkable men, and they played the same role, confronting Israel's kings for idolatry and injustice. And ultimately, they were unsuccessful in turning Israel back from apostasy. In the next section, the northern kingdom is rocked by a bloody revolution started by a king named Jehu, who destroys Ahab's family. And although Jehu was at first commissioned by God, his violence just gets out of control, and it creates the spiral of political assassinations and rebellions from which Israel never recovered. Coup follows coup after Jehu, and each king follows other gods, allows horrible injustice. It all leads up to 2 Kings chapter 17. The big bad empire of Assyria swoops down and takes out the northern kingdom altogether. And the capital city of Samaria is conquered, and the Israelites are exiled and scattered throughout the ancient world. Now, chapter 17 is key. The author stops the story and offers this prophetic reflection on what's just happened. He blames the downfall of the northern kingdom on the idolatry and covenant unfaithfulness of Israel and its kings. And so, God has allowed them to face the consequences of their decisions. The final movement of the book tells the story of the lone southern kingdom. And here we meet some very heroic kings, like Hezekiah, who trusts God when the armies of Assyria come knocking on Jerusalem's door. Or Josiah, who discovers this lost scroll of the Torah in the temple. So he starts reading it, he's convicted, and he institutes religious reforms to remove idolatry and Canaanite influences from the land. But Judah is just too far gone. The king, right in between these two, Manasseh, he's the worst by far. So he not only introduces the worship of idol statues into the Jerusalem temple, he also institutes child sacrifice. And so God sends prophets to say, the time is up, Israel has reached the point of no return. The final chapters tell the story of the Babylonian Empire coming to invade Jerusalem, destroy the temple, and carry the people and the royal line of David off into exile. And so the story ends leaving us wondering, is God done with Israel? Is he done with the line of David? Well, the final paragraph zooms about 40 years forward into the exile, and it tells a very odd story. It's about Jehoiakim, a descendant from David, who would have been king if he was back in Jerusalem. And the king of Babylon releases him from prison and invites him to eat at the royal table for the rest of his life, and the book ends. So it's not much, but it's a story that gives a glimmer of hope that God has not abandoned the line of David. So the question now is, how is God going to fulfill his promises to Abraham, to David? How is he going to bless the nations and bring the Messianic kingdom? And to answer those questions, you have to read on into the wisdom and the prophetic books. But for now, that's the book of Kings.
pretty, you like that?
Yeah, it's really nice.
How you like getting fed by a fire hose?
But Chronicles, mentioned that in Chronicles that Bernie did.
Oh, yeah. So the idea here is the big arch that's going on here, okay? And we've gone through 1st and 2nd Samuel. We're in the midst of 1st Kings, going into, we're really 1st Kings right now. And we'll be into 2nd Kings the next 2 weeks, all right? And then where did Chronicles fit? Okay, because Chronicles is sort of weird. Chronicles covers some of 1st and 2nd Samuel, most all of 1st and 2nd Kings, but it gives different material and sometimes the same material. Now, I'm going to show you the Chronicles video, and again, we're working on Solomon right now, and we're working on the temple this lesson. So some of the stuff is preview of what's coming on, but I sort of want you to pay attention to this 2-line story. One is the line of David and the future of a messianic king, and then also how the temple is fitting into all of this, okay? And it's sort of interesting. Now, I'm going to tell you what I've always learned about Chronicles, and I don't know if it's right or wrong. So I'm just going to tell you what I've learned, and I don't know if it's right or wrong, so take it with that grain of salt, okay? And that is 1st and 2nd Samuel and Kings is the story of what's going on from the viewpoint of man. So if we want to take it the lower story or upper story, it's the view of the lower story. And again, I don't know if this is true or not, but it's what I've always been taught, that Chronicles is the view of God and what God's story is. Think of it as the upper story. Chew on it when you think of it that way.
Because it's not detailed.
To clarify for me, so the arrows on either end of Chronicles covers all of that timeline.
Yeah, I don't think it goes into as much of Samuel as that sort of makes it look like it does, but it sits in the bottom and goes through really the whole line of kings, and then really the return from exile. And the video is going to sort of talk a little bit about that. But the idea is this Chronicles sits under the bottom here with Samuel and Kings sort of intertwined there. These 3 books go together, even though they're separate. And what usually happens is when we get to Chronicles, we don't want to read it because we think we've already heard the story before. But they're all really one story sort of looked together.
Well, I was told, or I guess understood, that the gospel, or the gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are a repetition of Christ's life from different viewpoints.
Yeah.
And for different audiences.
Yeah,
for
for different audiences,
Yeah.
different viewpoints.
Yeah.
So, but the stories overlap each other.
Yes.
And that's what's happening in the Old Testament is something similar, except you don't know. I don't get the same kind of a sense when I read the Old Testament.
I would agree with that, yeah.
Like when you read the New Testament.
Yeah. I mean, they like the Gospels are intertwined story.
Right.
Where these, it's really looking at not only different viewpoints, but also looking forward, looking backwards. You know what I mean?
It jumps around a bit
Yeah, it
too.
jumps
They
around, right.
insert things
Yeah.
that don't seem to fit in there, and
But what you're going to find out is it's like they do. They're written for a purpose. So here's another video. This is on Chronicles, and hopefully it sort of answers a little bit of what you're talking or thinking about.
The books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. While they're 2 separate books in our Bibles, that division is not original. Due to scroll length, the book was divided in 2, but it was written as one book with one coherent storyline. Now, in our English Bibles, Chronicles comes after the books of Samuel and Kings, and most of Chronicles is actually repeat content from those books. And so most modern readers, when they come to Chronicles, they think, wait a minute, I just read all of this, and so they skip it. And that's a shame, because this book is really unique and important in the Bible. In the traditional Jewish ordering of the Bible, Chronicles is actually the last book, because it summarizes all of the Jewish scriptures. The first word in the book is Adam, the first character at the beginning of the story, and then the last paragraph announces the return of Israel from exile. Now, we don't know who wrote this book, but we can tell from details within it. It was produced by somebody who lived a couple hundred years after the Israelites returned from the Babylonian exile. Now, for this author, Jerusalem and the temple were rebuilt some time ago, and as we learned from Ezra and Nehemiah, things were not going well. The great prophetic hope was that the city and the temple would be rebuilt, that God would come to live among his people, the Messianic king would come, and all the nations would come live under his peaceful rule, and none of that has happened. And so the author of Chronicles has reshaped these stories of David and Solomon and the kings of the past in order to provide a message of hope for the future. And we'll see that he's designed this book to emphasize two clear themes. First, the hope of the coming Messianic king, and second, the hope for a new temple. Let's just dive in and we'll see these themes all over the book. First Chronicles begins with 9 chapters of genealogies, long lists of names. And you'll read these and think that this is kind of boring, and that may be true for you, but actually they're very, very important. The author is summarizing here the whole storyline of the Old Testament by naming all of the key characters in the stories. And as he does so, he shapes the genealogies to emphasize 2 key lineages. First is the line of the promised Messianic king. So lots of space is dedicated to tracing the line of Judah that led all the way to King David, to whom the Messianic promise was given. Then from David, the author traces that line up into his own day. The other family line that receives lots of attention here is that of the priesthood, the descendants of Aaron, who of course served in the temple. And so right from the start, you can see the 2 main themes. The author's hope of the Messiah coming to build a new temple, and it's rooted in these ancient genealogies. Now after that, the author moves into the stories about David, and most of these are going to be familiar to you from the book of Samuel, but again, there's some really important differences. So first of all, the author leaves out all of the negative stories about David, where he's portrayed as weak or immoral. So Saul chasing David around the desert and persecuting him, the story of David's adultery with Bathsheba and then murdering her husband, all of that is gone. And what's left are the stories that portray David as a good guy. And not only that, there's also new additional material that you won't find in the book of Samuel that shows David in a very positive light. So there's a large block of chapters where David makes preparations for the temple. He arranges resources and builders and Levites and choirs. And not only that, the author also portrays David as a Moses-like figure. God gives David plans for building the temple just as he gave plans to Moses for building the tabernacle. So why all this new material about David? The author's not trying to hide David's flaws. He knows that anybody can go read about them in the book of Samuel. Rather, he's trying to portray David as the ideal king in order to make him an image or a type of the future Messiah from the line of David. It's very similar to how Jeremiah or Ezekiel spoke of the coming Messiah as a new David. This is most clear in how the author retells the story of God's covenant promise to David in 1 Chronicles 17. When you compare this story with its parallel in 2 Samuel 7, you'll see that the author of Chronicles is highlighting that neither David nor Solomon nor any of the kings from his line were the Messianic king, and that when the Messiah does come, he will be a king like David. And so for this author, these stories about David from the past are what sustain his hope for the future. After David dies, we move into 2 Chronicles, which focuses on the kings that lived in Jerusalem. And again, there's lots of overlap with 1st and 2nd Kings, but there are many key differences. So the author has left out all of the stories about the kings of northern Israel so he can just focus on the line of David. And there's lots of new material about these kings from David's line. He highlights the kings that were obedient to God, and he adds new stories about how their obedience led to success and God's blessing. But he also adds new stories about kings who were unfaithful to God. They didn't follow the Torah, they led Israel to worship idols, and these kings faced horrible consequences, all leading up to Israel's exile, a mess of their own making. And so this whole section becomes a series of character studies where the author wants later generations of Israelites to learn from their family history, and so become faithful to their God and the Torah. Now the book's conclusion is really unique too. At the very end of the book, the king of the Persians. His name's Cyrus. And he tells the Israelites that they can go back home, return from exile, rebuild the city and the temple. And he says, last line of the book, whoever there is among you, of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him, and let him go up. And that's how the book ends, with an incomplete statement. Now, of course, the author knows about the first return from exile and the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah. But clearly, in his view, the prophetic hopes of Israel were not fulfilled in those events. And so this incomplete ending shows that the author's hope is set on yet another return from exile, when the Messiah will finally come to rebuild the temple and restore God's people. And so the book of Chronicles, the final book of the Jewish scriptures, it ends by pointing forward. It calls God's people to look back in order to look ahead, because the past has become the source of hope for the future. So Chronicles concludes the Old Testament as a story in search of an ending. And that's what this book is all about.
Doesn't it make so much more sense if you put Chronicles at the end of the Old Testament? It's pretty cool, because what it's doing is pointing, this whole thing is pointing to Jesus. And not only is it pointing to Jesus from a first coming standpoint, but it's also pointing to his second coming. It's cool.
Regardless of this book says they think it's Ezra.
And that it's possible. I mean, because he would be in the right spot.
Yeah.
He would be in the right
spot.
spot.
All that through and came back.
Okay, so you ready for some fun?
Okay, yeah.
All right, you're each going to have to answer 2 questions. All right, are you ready?
Without help.
Without help. So here are your 2 questions. If you were a superhero, what superpower would you want? And the second question is JFK assassination. Is it a conspiracy or a single gun? All right, go.
I would want wisdom, and I think it was conspiracy.
Okay.
Okay, repeat what you said.
She wants wisdom. She's cheating.
Yeah, that's all. But that's okay. And number 2.
She thinks it's a conspiracy. All right.
Okay.
You're a superhero.
What power would you want? Oh, I know what I want.
Guess I'd like to be able to think.
Like to be able to think. Okay. I'm going to go with wisdom. Discernment. There you go.
Discernment's different.
Single gun.
Single gun. Okay. That's going to be a fight for home. All right.
I don't know about the power. I like Emma's answer.
Oh, you can take Emma's answer. It's fine. Then you're cheating.
I think it was another word. Maybe by the time I think it was a single member, but he had connections that were ties.
I really,
Not necessarily a conspiracy, but yeah, he had ties.
All right.
yeah.
I say single gun. I don't know.
You know what?
Pick one.
Maybe like a shield around me. Yeah, I like
I
the
want the power of healing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that was
What was
without a
Marty's
doubt.
power and what was
And
But
I'm
Marty wants to cheat and steal
I'll try
Emma's.
to keep thinking.
She's still thinking.
And I'm with Marty on that. I think it's a single gunman, but I think there was other people egging him on or ties or something. I don't think it was a big conspiracy. Go ahead.
I like to be invisible.
All right.
Be invisible?
I know. There's so many things there.
Yeah.
And it's a single gun.
Single gun? All right.
Invisible.
Why? That's just me.
You know. You can copy.
You,
I guess wisdom.
all right.
Okay, so I dare to be different here. I'm only daring to be different because this is what I believe. Wisdom is not a superpower because we already have it.
Ooh.
Oh, well.
Yes, we
She
have
just
it.
put
And
you
we
all
can
in.
have. And we
I
can
said
have
even
more
more.
wisdom anytime we need to. It tells us this.
Yeah.
So, superpowers, I wouldn't want any of the superpowers, and I would have to go with assassination.
Well, which one?
Which one?
Oh,
Conspiracy?
it's assassination, conspiracy.
Is it a conspiracy or a single gun?
The question is this ever gonna die down? Is ever, I think I would go with the conspiracy.
All right.
At least you're not asking us why we're answering that.
All right. So Solomon, that's always a fun little game to play. Solomon got asked, if you want to think about it, what superpower did he want? So if you look in your Bible, 1 Kings, starting in verse 5, you get this wonderful conversation. Of course, Solomon's asleep, and it says, yeah, in Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream at night, and God said, "Ask what you wish me to give you." Then Solomon said, of course, in his dream, "You have shown great loving kindness to your servant David, my father, according as he walked before you in truth, and righteousness and uprightness of heart towards you. And you have reserved for him this great loving kindness, that you have given him a son to sit on his throne, as it is this day. Now, O Lord God, my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David. Yet I am but a little child," who's about 20 years old. "I do not know how to go out or come in. Your servant is in the midst of your people, which you have chosen, a great people who are too many to be numbered. So, give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil, for who is able to judge this great people of yours?" Whoa. Now, Solomon took the throne at 20. But you always hear this, Solomon was a mama's boy. Okay? Solomon was not David's choice.
Right.
It was Bathsheba's choice.
But Absalom was already killed.
Absalom was already killed. Yeah. And another one of David's sons was trying to take the throne because David was on his deathbed, basically. So basically, Solomon asked for wisdom, and boy did he get it. So let's watch the teen video. It's only about 2 minutes long, and then we'll go through Solomon. The whole outline that you have, we're going to go through in about maybe 2 minutes.
Sure.
Okay.
I like the video.
On Solomon.
Right before King David died, he told his son Solomon to be strong, follow God's ways, and no matter what, not to worship other gods. Shortly after Solomon took over as king, God appeared to him and said, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." Worried about following in his father's footsteps, Solomon asked God to give him wisdom, to know the difference between right and wrong. God not only promised to give Solomon wisdom, but great riches and honor as well. The first test of Solomon's wisdom happened when 2 prostitutes came to him. There was a young child that each of them claimed was theirs. Solomon knew one of them had to be mine. So he asked his servants to bring out a sword and suggested to the woman that he cut the boy in 2 and give each of them half. One of the women was so worried that the boy would be killed that she immediately asked Solomon to give the child to the other woman. Solomon saw her love and protection and knew that it had to be her baby, so he gave the boy to her. The Israelites were in awe of Solomon's great wisdom. He ruled for many years, growing in wealth and fame. He also wrote down many wise sayings called Proverbs. During his reign, Solomon planned to finish building the temple his father David wanted to build. They built a temple that was not incredibly large, but was unbelievably beautiful and detailed. It was 90 feet by 30 feet and had 2 bronze pillars that led into the place where sacrifices were made. When it was finished, Solomon and the other leaders sacrificed a huge number of animals in worship to God. When they did, the whole temple filled with a thick cloud of smoke. Solomon prayed, asking God to meet the Israelites in the temple and hear their prayers. When Solomon finished praying, fire came down from the sky and burned up the animal sacrifices. That night, God appeared to Solomon again and promised to bless him in all that he did, as long as he would keep following God. In some areas, Solomon did follow what God told him to, but in others, like worshiping other gods, he failed. Because of this, the kingdom of Israel would be taken from his sons, and they would not enjoy the peaceful, successful reign that he had.
Yeah, that's Solomon is a cool cat from the standpoint of he's a mixed bag of tricks, but he when he started out, he was about 20 years old, reigned for 39, 40 years. When he started out, he and David planned on who they had to take out first. So in essence, the ways of a king is when the king takes over, he establishes rule usually in a bloody bath. Yep. So within 4 years, he starts to build the temple. The temple takes about 7 years to build. And then, he is wise in so many things. And we're told that he wrote over 3,000 Proverbs. And I love this. Not 1,000 songs, but 1,005.
Yeah, it was crazy.
Okay. Now, some people think that the Song of Solomon is 5 different songs, and that's why it's 1,005. Okay?
Oh.
Now, take that for what it's worth. All right? But the amount of wealth that he acquired is beyond belief. It talks about where silver was so plentiful that it was like rocks. When you look at the temple and how much gold was in there, it was, I think it was something like 40 to 70 tons of gold. It's amazing. And the temple, Solomon's temple, is not big compared to Herod's temple. All right? Now you get the other side of Solomon. We get the big except. And this is right up front in the introduction in 1 Kings 3:3. It says, "Now Solomon loved the Lord, walked in the statute of his father David, except he sacrificed and burnt incense on the high places," idolatry. All right? He also, go ahead.
But I've been sort of reading other stuff that says they did not have a temple. I'm trying to remember. I should have written down what I was reading specifically there, because there's now the temple that.
Yeah, but they had the tabernacle.
They have certain places where they.
Yeah, they did.
Go
Because the tabernacle is still in. It's in Jerusalem now. It's in Jerusalem because it's already been brought. David already brought the Ark of the
Yeah,
Covenant.
it's there.
And so it's already set up. So.
Okay, then that's probably David.
Yeah.
They named several cities where.
Well,
Yeah,
now
it's
David's
in
time
another
they did, because the tabernacle was in Shiloh, so they went to certain towns. But Solomon, he got into idolatry big time. Now, part of the reason that he got into idolatry was the 700 wives and 300 concubines. So he conscripted basically slave labor. He's a builder. Solomon built a lot. All right, built a lot. His palace, the temple itself around Jerusalem. Solomon was a builder. This was a time of peace.
Yeah.
One of the reasons that it was a time of peace was because he married everybody's daughter. We know from
deal with the harem and
Lebanon. Hold on to that thought, because I'm going to come back to this. He taxed the nation heavily, because we know that from Rehoboam. When he became king, the advisors came and said, you got to lay up on taxes. And he's like, no, tax them more. And he basically broke every rule that God set forth to be a good king. So that's Solomon, all right? That's Solomon. Now, you bring up Hiram or Ahiram. That is is Phoenicia. Okay, now, I went and saw the Moses conspiracy yesterday. It is awesome. It's really, really good. But what it talks about, it's right there with Hiram and Aharon, is one of the things about the current agnostic, especially agnostic or attack on the Bible and attack on God, is how could Moses, first of all, have written the Bible? And there was no Exodus. Now, if you saw the other Patterns of Evidence movie on Exodus, he sort of answered that. But what he talks about is who came up with an alphabet? I think it's the Phoenicians, right? Because that's what
attributed that.
that's attributed to. They took it back in this movie. I'm going to ruin the movie for you. I'm just spoiler alert. But they took it back. The Egyptians had the hieroglyphs, okay? And in essence, if you were to believe that the Bible is real and that Moses wrote it down, because God told Moses to write it down in a book over and over again, all right? Well, he has to have the ability to write it. That means he has to have a language or a script. The alphabet, when you think about it, is the most amazing thing in the world. Because without an alphabet, we're sitting there doing, basically pictures and hieroglyphs. Well, they trace this alphabet back to the time of Egypt and to this guy that was second in command called Joseph. When Joseph took over, he had to run it, and he basically came up with an alphabet. Okay, you don't tell me that's God inspired, because he's setting up basically Moses. So long story short, they trace this all back, and they show that after the Exodus around 1450, that script that they found, they call it Proto-Semitic script, is no longer in Egypt anymore. It's moved to Canaan. Huh. Who moved to Canaan? All right. And then in some of these old writings, it talks about that the Israelites at the time of Solomon basically taught the Phoenicians this old script that ended up being all of these languages. And then the Phoenicians are the ones who taught it to the Greeks. So it's a very interesting thing, because Hiram was hired basically by Solomon to get some of those materials and the craftsmen. And one of the things that they found, archaeology-wise, is a Hiram. Okay, Hiram, and then in the Phoenician, it's a Hiram. On his tomb is this script that they think Moses wrote the Bible. So it's a very interesting story, and it's all centered right around this time. And it's just intriguing. That was a side note, but not part of the lesson. But it's very, very interesting.
But even David did Hiram too.
Oh, yeah,
and
yeah.
they'd already gotten a coalition going, or an agreement going, and they paid him in bushels, whatever the things is, weeks, so many bushels of wheat.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Or I don't know what
Yeah,
it is.
yeah. So let's watch the adult video. You ready for that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All I can say is, do you like frogs?
No.
Okay, because it won't make sense until you get a little bit farther along. But when the girl's sitting there in the kitchen with the water boiling, think frogs.
This is your story. This is my story. But most of all, this is the greatest story ever told. This is God's story. When King David was very old, he could not keep warm, even when they put covers over him. Bathsheba went to see the aged king in his room, where Abishag the Shunammite was attending him. Bathsheba bowed down, prostrating herself before the king. "What is it you want?" the king asked. She said to him, "My lord, you yourself swore to me, your servant, by the Lord your God, Solomon your son shall be king after me, and he will sit on my throne." The king then took an oath, "As surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of every trouble, I will surely carry out this very day what I swore to you by the Lord, the God of Israel. Solomon your son shall be king after me, and he will sit on my throne in my place." Then Bathsheba bowed down with her face to the ground, prostrating herself before the king, and said, "May the Lord, King David, live forever." When the time drew near for David to die, he gave a charge to Solomon his son. "I'm about to go the way of all the earth," he said. "So be strong, act like a man, and observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in obedience to him, and keep his decrees and commands, his laws and regulations, as written in the law of Moses. Do this so that you may prosper in all you do, and wherever you go, and that the Lord may keep his promise to me. If your descendants watch how they live, and if they walk faithfully before me with all their heart and soul, you will never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel."
I'd like to tell you something I've learned about frogs. Maybe you've heard of this research done some time ago, but it really is very relevant to our lesson today. The conclusion of the research: if you put a frog in a boiling pot of water, it'll jump out. However, if you put a frog in a lukewarm pot of water and slowly turn up the heat, you'll be able to cook him and have some scrumptious frog legs for dinner. I heard they taste like chicken. How can this be? A frog can notice sudden changes like boiling water, but does not detect small incremental changes. When the frog does, it's too late. This is the story of Solomon, the main character of chapter 13 of the story. He started off as a strong frog. He could leap over lily pads like no one else. He was a blue blood frog, son of a king. Any princess would consider it a huge privilege to kiss this frog, and in the end, 700 do. But he got himself in a lukewarm pot of water that slowly got hotter and eventually cooked him. He started off strong, but finished poorly. Let me tell you of his tale. Chapter 13 opens up with King David at his end. He maintains his promise to make the son of Bathsheba the next king. Solomon had everything going for him. His dad is passing the leadership to him in great shape. They are financially successful and strong. No $1 trillion debt hanging over him. They are not at war. No Gaza Strip problems or squabbles with the Palestinians like we see so much today. King David even gave him the secrets of continued success in the speech you just heard. And Solomon starts off super strong. In this chapter, God comes to Solomon and tells him to ask for anything he wants. Solomon asks for wisdom to be able to carry out his duties, to properly govern the people, to discern right from wrong. Wow. How tempting not to ask for wealth or power or long life or a really cool car, or in Solomon's case, a 3-hump camel. God is pleased with Solomon's response, answers his request, and gives him wealth, honor, and power to boot. Solomon demonstrates this wisdom right off the bat. There are 2 ladies who have a dispute about a newborn baby. Both are claiming to be the mother. Solomon tells his men to cut the baby in 2 and give each mother a half. The first woman thought this was a reasonable solution. The second woman asked for the baby to be given to the first, unharmed. Showing wisdom, Solomon gave the baby to the second woman. Now, I tried this with my boys when they were younger, fighting over Hot Wheel cars. It didn't work so well. They wanted to see me saw it in 2. Solomon wrote his wisdom down for all of us to read. Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon are filled with a sampling of lukewarm pots of water we should avoid. For example, here's one. Better to live in a desert than with a quarrelsome and naggy wife. Well, that's not the one I was thinking of. How about this one in Proverbs? A gossip betrays a confidence, so avoid anyone who talks too much. In just his 4th year as king, he starts to build the temple for God's presence to rest. When the temple is complete, God comes to Solomon and tells him in plain English, or rather Hebrew, that if you continue to follow me, you will finish strong, and you will pass the kingdom to your son in the same great shape your father did for you. However, if you don't follow me, you'll get cooked, and it will cause a spiral in the nation, and the throne will be taken from your family. Solomon's popularity is growing. He is a rock star. People come from everywhere to see him and sit at his feet like the Queen of Sheba. Jeremiah may have been a bullfrog, but so was Solomon. But then we come to the end of Solomon's life and his 40-year reign, and we see he got cooked. All kinds of trouble and adversaries emerge. It ends up destroying the nation. He started strong, but finished poorly. What happened? Solomon jumped into one of those proverbial pots of lukewarm water he wrote about. Which one? Let me read it to you. King Solomon, however, loved many wives besides Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely, as David his father had done. Solomon knew this was a bad idea. He wrote about it. God told him straight up, but Solomon jumped in anyway. He might have thought he was strong enough to handle it. His passion may have simply been greater than his love for wisdom. He jumps in the pot and everything seems to be working just fine. But as Solomon grew older, as time passed, the pot began to simmer and Solomon's strength weakened. He starts worshiping other gods, and that's the boiling point. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't want to end up cooked in a boiling pot. Do you? Yet none of us wakes up and says, I'd like to get boiled to death. I'd like to wreck and ruin my life and the lives of others. I'd like to end up as a plate of frog legs that taste like chicken. It doesn't happen overnight. We jump in a pot of lukewarm water and we fail to see that the devil is turning up the flame underneath. But it happens to the best of us. If Solomon was the wisest guy to ever live and he jumped in, what makes us think we are too smart to do such a thing? Now, if you're a Christian, you need to realize that God has a call in our life, a purpose. Just like the Israelites and Solomon were called to point people to Christ by the way they lived, so we are a part of the church and are also called to point people to Christ by our lives. God has put people into our lives, our family, people we work with, people we go to school with, people we live around. How we live our lives in Christ before them will give witness that Jesus is not dead, but alive, resurrected. In other words, how we live our lives matter. Our prayer needs to be that we'll not only start strong, but finish strong. The truth is, many hearing these words have already been cooked in a pot of some sort. It may be what drew you to the study of the story in the first place. You're looking for help, you're looking for mercy. Listen to this. Even though this didn't stop the avalanche of consequences at the end of Solomon's life, or even after, he realizes what he has done and turns back to God. We see this at the conclusion of his great book, the book of Ecclesiastes. Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of every human being. It is never too late to come back to God. He will receive you with open arms.
I didn't know I did.
No, he's good. He's great.
Maybe, yeah.
Okay. So, bring up the man of honor. So he ended with just a great statement that we are the church, and we're going to talk about that here in a little bit when we talk about the temple. And our culture puts us in the water, and the devil turns up the heat.
Just little by little.
And the two questions that are up here is, first, name some examples of dangerous and incremental changes happening around us that we can fail to notice.
That we can fail in them?
We can just start to accept it little by little.
Yeah. Politics.
Oh, authority in politics.
I'm thinking.
Authority in politics. All authority comes from God, whether we like it or not.
Prayer in schools and then enough commandments and
Oh yeah.
Courthouses.
Yeah. Nativity scenes in courthouses. And,
they want
I don't think we failed to notice.
Yeah, I think we know, so then I'm trying to think of something that just.
well,
That's the tricky part is that we can fail to notice.
yeah, I guess think of it this way. Instead of, I agree with you,
It's like
instead of fail to
creeping
notice,
in.
but fail to do
It's
anything.
taking away.
Well, or,
Just
the
accept
thing
it.
that
That
jumped
we
to
can
my
say
mind
it.
was
I think
abortion.
Oh,
Was it what?
yeah.
What'd you say?
Yeah,
But I
abortion.
don't think we failed to do anything, we just haven't been successful
In the world.
turning that corner.
Yeah.
What did you say? I didn't hear you.
Abortion.
Abortion, that's a great one, yeah.
But as a church.
This acceptance.
I absolutely agree
Yeah.
with that, but my question is, as a church, where, what, so it's just a question, what is the church supposed to do? If you're talking about a whole body of people
Uh-huh.
as the church, which is what we
But
are.
that's the second question there.
Well, so think about this. So there's a difference between sin. I'm just going to I'll just throw it out there. Sin happening in the secular world and sin happening in the church body. When was the last time that you saw church discipline?
So a church discipline?
Church discipline. So there in Paul writes about it.
The church discipline that like.
No. What I'm talking about is
The person who is.
the person that's in the body.
And is in the presence, people acknowledge that these things are happening with this person, and yet those powers that be, whether it be the board, I don't think
Oh, you mean
the
they
board
ignore
is it, but the pastor, the associate, whoever sits down with this person and helps to hold them accountable
Well, Jesus,
for whatever it is they're doing or not doing.
Jesus' own words in Matthew is, if your brother has sinned, go talk to him.
Well, isn't that what's kind of happening with the Methodist Church now with this,
Right.
with the gay?
Oh yeah,
And the Catholic Church.
yeah.
Well, all of the churches to some
Well, I mean,
But
greater or lesser degree.
That speaks to the first question.
Yeah.
That is one of the very things, and I've seen it happen in a few churches that I've been part of. And it's been absolutely amazing to see that nothing was done.
Yeah.
But right now, we're talking specifically abortion, so within the body. We're talking about a person within the body who says,
well, I'm not necessarily talking about abortion,
No.
but I'm talking about any. So, if a brother in Christ, brother or sister in Christ, openly sins, the prescription for that is first go talk to them. If they don't, one-on-one. If they don't accept it, bring the elders.
elders are supposed to. What
Well,
does
hold on.
the sin need to be?
Hold on. It doesn't matter.
No matter what it is.
It doesn't matter what it is.
Everybody here sins probably every
Sure.
single day with
Yeah.
a thought with something.
But what I'm saying is, church discipline is first is you go and talk to the brothers. Second is you take another person with them, and it's supposed to be the elders. And after that, you bring them in front of the church, and if they do not, basically repent, then they're supposed to be cast out until they can. Yeah.
Nobody does that.
Nobody does it.
I don't care where it is.
Yep.
So that's just gonna be another term.
No, they don't get kicked out. I mean, I don't think anybody approaches them that way.
I know.
I think if you as a person went to your pastor and quiet, that would be the big thing, that you might see that. You know what I mean, like in his office,
Well, but
and say, hey, I need help with this.
yeah, I mean, but
As a whole body of church, I've never seen it.
I know, but that's what's prescribed in the scripture. That's what I mean by church.
Absolutely, it's what we're told to do.
And that's what church discipline is.
Yes.
And
Did somebody go to Solomon? Was it Nathan? Who was it?
no, that was David.
That was David.
Nobody went to Solomon.
No, none of them did?
Nope.
Somebody did.
God went to Solomon the third time. No, yeah, he talked to him twice at first, and then at the end he came back and he said, you have disregarded my commands.
The reason I'm asking you to even be more specific, for example, one of the churches I was associated with in California, the associate pastor, not quite associate pastor, but up there with pastor in whatever position his was, which I can't remember, he started hanging around with a woman who was not married. He was married. Quote, and of course this can be a big problem, and this is why Gary does not. If a woman wants to talk to him, that door stays open at all times.
Yeah.
But anyway, it ended up that she got pregnant, and the church body itself did absolutely nothing.
Yep.
He maintained his position.
Yeah.
She left, and that's just a real little tiny piece of it, but that requires discipline.
But it's
church discipline.
But actually, I'll come back to it. You've never seen a church do it. We've actually seen 2 mega churches do church discipline to their own pastors.
Oh, yeah.
Heibel
Yes, Bible.
and what's the guy in Chicago?
Well, if you look at that.
I can't remember the guy in
You look
Chicago.
at Jerry Farwell and you can look at
Yeah.
Jim Swagger too.
So
It
it has happened.
That
It
has
has
happened.
We don't
gone.
do it probably we don't do it as often as we should.
As a pastor in a high position
Yeah.
too.
But we don't do it as often as we should, mostly because we're scared to lose members. It's become, in essence, not what the Church of Acts was. It's become more of a social club because we're worried, I mean, let's be straight. I hate saying it. We're worried about, well, if people leave the church, then we won't get their offerings, and then we can't pay for everything. I mean, that's a sad state of the culture right now, because we'll sit here and no church is perfect. And how many fights in churches over worship style and music?
Yeah.
The pastor preaches too long. I mean, how much does that happen? And what it comes to, and where I'm going with it before I sort of close this part of it is, we jump in the water of the culture.
And it just keeps hitting them.
Where does that start and stop, though? I mean,
It's tough.
I think that's really the essence of the problem is, who is it that determines whether someone's doing something that's sinful or not? So
We're all doing something.
Right.
Yeah, we
That's how you do the
It's
discipline.
become very common now to use a default kind of a situation of driving and all of the terrible drivers that are out there and what we do, in response. So is that a sin? Well, I don't know. I guess it is, but I don't know if I want to get called up to the church office and
Well, you
say,
would,
hey,
but
I
if
heard
you-
you got mad because somebody cut you off.
But see, you would never get brought up to the church office. If one of your brothers came up to you and said, dude, I saw you flip off somebody when you're coming to church because they cut you off, and you sat there and said, you know what, I was wrong.
Oh, everybody said that.
I don't know if you'd say it, but I might say it. I was wrong. Okay, that's it.
Yeah, that's what he said.
But it's when,
Because we're supposed to forgive you.
yeah, that's right.
Right.
That's right. That's it. So there's 2 more steps until you brought up to the church.
Yeah, okay, but you know what I mean.
So,
So so you got somebody like, I'm having a bad day and I tell you, hey,
yeah.
mind your own business.
But it's I don't know. Go ahead.
Okay, and I understand that. Otherwise, everybody's pointing the finger
Yeah.
that you, if you
Well,
just,
that's the
you
other
just
thing
did
that I
this, you
think
did
starts
that.
happening
Never.
is now everybody's, becomes a cop.
Yeah.
Everybody's walking around looking for, oh, I saw what you did.
I don't think
Well,
it's that
no,
way.
they're not even looking for a cop, they're just videoing it on their cell phone. They want the money.
That's the danger. That's the danger of this righteous indignation.
Exactly. You gotta be
Where
careful.
That's just a
people are,
different pot of warm water.
it's
No.
a different. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
And when we're talking about that kind of discipline, and when we talk about actually pulling out the scriptures from
Yeah.
the First Testament, we're talking first and foremost specifically about the people in your body, in your church, who are in positions of authority that you see,
Yeah.
or they treat you.
Oh, yeah.
We're talking real specific, not just another member of the church, but a person who has a position of power, anybody in that position.
Yeah, but
who treats you a certain way, or is.
This is the tricky
It is
part.
because-
But this is the tricky part too, though, is this is where non-believers look at us hypocritical.
We don't say anything, you're right.
And
That's the other side of it.
that becomes the problem. Do I know the answer to all
No,
this?
you don't, you just put it out.
No, but it comes down to this, do we get in the same pot that Solomon got to, and how far do you let it go until it's a problem? And I don't know the answer. I really don't. I know what the scripture says.
Yeah, I think he was just trying to please everybody, like marry everybody for the peace, sure.
He couldn't
Hey,
please 1,000
I'm
women,
sorry.
I don't think.
Okay,
Yeah.
so the 700 wives, 700
300
wives,
concubines?
I can buy that.
No.
300 concubines?
On top of it?
I can't buy that.
Unless he armed them all.
So, Chris, this morning we had Matt's preaching, and he preached almost to this thing about, look in the mirror, what do you see?
Yeah.
Didn't he? And this would almost apply to that. And remember what he said? He said, you should be looking more like Jesus. You still see yourself.
Yeah.
So I think and I thought that was such a good image of it. And they did this little video that was really good too, about chiseling away. I'm God. No, you're not God. I need chiseling away and all the stuff that is bad. So I think that's what we have to do, because what do you do to resist these changes?
Hold on to that thought.
Okay. I will.
Because
Is it coming back?
we're coming to it.
Okay.
That's where this all ties in together. So I mean, I'm going to wrap up Solomon so I can get into the temple.
Okay.
This is it right here. This is Ecclesiastes, the last verse, which is basically fear the Lord and keep His commandments. I mean, it comes down to that. When you get through Solomon and Ecclesiastes, when he's an old man, he's basically, that's it. That's it. And fear is not scared, it's reverence. Yeah.
So for us, we're going to switch from Old Testament. For New Testament believers, what we're supposed to stand on and what we're supposed to absolutely do every single day of our lives is to love the Lord our God with all our soul, heart, and soul. And two, the second is just like it, is to love everybody else, not just your person next to you, your neighbor,
Yep.
not just someone you like, but everyone. And it says, whatever that, all of the law and the prophets rest on those two things.
But
That's what we need to do.
But don't forget the last thing. Go and make disciples. Because I think what
Yes.
happens in the church,
But if you cannot love each other,
You gotta
you're
love-
not going to be willing to go and make disciples.
absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely. Okay, let's go into some fun stuff. Because this temple that David planned, basically God gave him the plans that he passed on to Solomon, and Solomon built, is a big freaking deal. All right? It's a big deal that I can tell you, when you hear about the tabernacle and all the instructions, and when you hear about the temple and all of its instructions, you're like, oh, this is boring. This is the greatest thing in the world. So we're going to talk about the overview of the temple in God's plan. All right? And it starts in the Garden of Eden and the fall. It starts at creation. The sacrifices and the atonement for sin, and how that is part of the temple, how Jesus is part of the temple, the church is the temple, and the New Jerusalem. So we're going to blow through some stuff here pretty quick. Creation. Let's go back to the Garden of Eden. Go back to first week. And I'm reading some stuff here. The Bible reveals that God created humans in his image, and that he desired from the beginning of creation to have a relationship with them. But when sin entered the world through the fall, humankind became alienated from God and forced God to exile them from his presence. To prevent them from the fallen state from re-entering the garden, which was represented as a sanctuary, temple word there, where God's holiness had dwelt, the Holy of Holies, he stationed what? Cherubim. So that they couldn't enter in. Now, one of the first things that happened is what? He gave them coats of skin. All right?
The first sacrifice.
The first sacrifice. So God revealed a way in which human sin could be forgiven and the broken relationship restored. God himself provided a substitute, an animal, whose blood, life, would atone for sin. That's happened right in the garden. This began the sacrificial system. God also revealed a way in which he would return his presence to humanity and restore that earthly relationship once enjoyed in Eden. This was the building of the tabernacle, all right, where the Shekinah glory would come and sit on the ark. Now, first of all, you notice the veils and walking in. What are there? Cherubims. What's on top of the Ark of the Covenant? Cherubims. What guarded the Garden of Eden? Cherubims. Okay? So we get this sacrificial system that we build on. Okay? First, it's the tabernacle. Then it becomes the Ark of the Covenant. All right? Because that was part of the covenant. And so God basically put all of this together. You can see the verses that came into it, and this is what they practiced. They practiced this sacrificial system where they brought an animal to be sacrificed to atone for the sins. I'm not even going into the festivals, all right, which is all part of it. Now, Jesus comes along, and Jesus becomes the perfect sacrifice. So when he came along, this is where the temple becomes so important, because the temple is where God's Shekinah glory resides. Started in the tabernacle, moved to the temple. Jesus, most of his teaching and ministry, not most, a lot of his teaching, much of his teaching took place in the temple. He was dedicated in the temple as an infant, brought sacrifices from his home in Galilee 3 times a year in the temple, and he taught there. And he called the temple my Father's house. And he obviously showed a lot of zeal, kicked everybody out, turned over the things, because it was a holy sanctuary. At the moment that Jesus died, the veil, which basically separated the inner sanctuary from the Holy of Holies, tore from the top to the bottom. All right? Now, when we go to the church, Paul uses temple language to describe where the Holy of Holies lives now. Us, believers. There is no temple right now. We're going to show you that here in a second. That's because
each one of us is.
We are it. All right? So after Jesus' resurrection and ascension into heaven, the Apostle Paul and the early church continued to worship at the temple. Paul used words, used sanctified to teach of the body of believers. He called it the holy presence of God that dwelled there. Therefore, don't defile it by sin. He's talking about us. Paul likewise stated that believers are sanctified. They're called saints, and they have spiritual service. This is all language of the temple and the priesthood. And then when we get to the New Jerusalem, that's where God's presence comes down and dwells with us. So now we get the fun. You have this.
Yeah. So I'm looking.
Okay, so we had the tabernacle, which basically was the tent. Okay? And that, the Shekinah glory. Shekinah means, let me grab my notes. Shekinah means the one who dwells. Okay, so the Shekinah glory was God's presence coming to earth. All right? So the Shekinah glory came in and filled the tabernacle. When Solomon built the temple, the ark went into the temple and the Shekinah glory filled the temple. Now, in Ezekiel 10, 1 through 22, and I don't know if this is in your notes or not, Ezekiel sees the Shekinah glory leave the temple, and not very long after that, in 56 BC, the Babylonians destroy the temple. They go into exile, and then 516, Zerubbabel basically is sent back and builds basically the second temple, which was a really bad imitation of Solomon's temple. And so it was really weak. It didn't have all the ornaments, they didn't have the money, the gold. So it was a second temple, but not a glorious temple.
Stop a minute. If you look, showing these notes, it says the ark. So the ark was still in total. It says it was hidden on holies of holies, and then it says it lies underneath. So they still had it when
They still had it. Yeah. Now, the ark lies hidden in a secret chamber. I'm not going to go too much into that because a lot of that's somewhat folklore.
Okay, but
But so this second temple that was built in 516 by Zerubbabel is pretty lame. It wasn't until 19 BC that Herod, under Roman occupation, starts to expand that temple and make it just beautiful. Now, here's the thing. 19 BC, we're only 20 years when Christ was born, okay? And they had just finished it not too long before it was destroyed, or before Jesus was there, sorry, all right? So the second temple, basically, you notice there's no Shekinah glory. All right? It's destroyed in 70 AD, and right now we're sitting in the church age, and the Dome of the Rock is sitting on that, what's left of the Temple Mount. Okay? Now, here's the fun part. What's that?
where's the ark?
Where's the ark?
We're still looking for it.
Okay. The Jews believe that it is hidden under
The dome?
the Dome of the Rock. So I don't know if I have a picture of it here or not, but there's physicists that basically have looked at this, and they come up with all these different areas of where they think the Holy of Holies was. And the thinking, one line of thinking is that it is under the Dome of the Rock, because what is the Dome of the Rock? It's Mount Moriah, where Abraham sacrificed Isaac. Now, what did the Islams think is that he went and sacrificed Ishmael. Okay, so some people think that the Holy of Holies is that Dome of the Rock, and the rock that the dome's over. All right. Anyways, sort of to go on, where the futuristic part of this is there will be a third temple, a tribulation temple, because they're ready to build it. They, the Israelis, are ready to build it now. It's already done. Basically, all of the stones are already cut. All of the implementations are already developed. It's Temple Institute. I watched a beautiful video where when you talk about David and all his preparations for the first temple, all the harps and all the music and all the implements, they have musicians that develop, based off of archaeology and the description in the Bible, the musical instruments. And they're training the Levite priesthood right now to do the sacrificial stuff again. So,
is this an available video, like
oh, yeah.
YouTube?
Yeah, you go to the Temple Institute. I'll put a link up.
Okay.
So we know that halfway through the tribulation, the Antichrist is going to desecrate the temple. All right? And then there will be a millennial temple after that, which is also known as Ezekiel's temple. Now, I just threw a whole bunch of stuff at you quick. Don't worry, because we're going to go over it like 80 more times.
Okay.
See that? Now go over here. This is Daniel's 70 weeks. Daniel shows and predicts all of this. All right? Now, during this church age, there's this wonderful gap. And part of, I don't want to get too far in advance, but so there's the Daniel thing. I don't have the Daniel chart in your note because I added it right before I left. I'll print this out and give it to you next week. All right, tabernacle. Solomon's temple.
So can I ask a question? So
Yes.
when they were sacrificing these animals, did they then just throw them in the fire and burn them? I'm trying to get a sense of the smells and how it felt. Because I mean, like, if you want to attract people, smelling food that's cooking is going to attract them.
Okay, so some of the animal sacrifices were completely burned up. Some of the sacrifices were freaking barbecue for the priests. All right, the blood. So you got this. You got the altar here. Okay, this is one of the reasons that they're trying to the physicists are trying to figure out where everything was, because the altar drained the blood into the Kidron Valley.
Yeah.
Okay, so you can sort of figure out where the altar is. You can figure out where everything else is positioned. All right, and so you basically have all of these implementations. My goodness, I wish I could go through the implementations. Can't do it because it would take too long. But all of those have meaning, and everything points to Christ. And it all starts with the Solomon's temple, that then leads to the second temple. Now, Solomon's temple leads to Herod's temple. Now, Herod's temple, again, Zerubbabel recreated it in 19 BC. Herod increased it, and this is the size of it. Think of this. If this temple wasn't rebuilt, where would Jesus be? Think of Jesus and his ministry and everything that went on around that temple. And realize that that temple isn't Solomon's. It's the rebuilt temple. All right? And so Jesus sees this temple, ministers to this temple, dies right outside of this temple, and when he dies on the cross, the veil opens, splits from top to bottom. It's a whole new covenant. Because when in the old system you killed an animal And then to get to the presence of the Holy of Holies, well, you had to have a mediator, the high priest, and the high priest could only go in once a year. And it was so crazy, the description of him going in, they put, and this is not in the Bible, this is in the rabbinic text, they put a rope around it. They put bells on it. And so the reason that they did that, because if he screwed up something along the way from his purification, they could pull him out. All right? So this temple had to be built. And go back to the Daniel 70 weeks. He predicts that it's going to be built in his thing, because it's been destroyed, but he predicted it. And he also predicted when the Messiah would come in and will be cut off. Remember that lesson? Okay. So, Herod's temple. That's the difference in size of that temple mount. Okay? The temple mount that we see today, only a very small portion of that was Solomon's temple. Most of that was Herod's temple, which was vastly enlarged. The thing that everybody says, and again, you're looking at other historical documents outside of the Bible, is that even though Solomon's temple was grandiose in size, Herod's temple was grandiose in size, Solomon's temple was still much more adorned and beautiful than
So when was the Rock of the Dome built?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know that.
I kind of remember when I was there.
Okay. So, get this. We got Shekinah glory, temples, and then no Shekinah glory. But then we've got the Shekinah glory back during the Millennial Temple. You want to read about the Millennial Temple? It's Ezekiel 40 through 48. So, one of the things that they believe from a prophetic standpoint is that the third temple will come about from being able to be built when the Antichrist comes down and makes a peace covenant. Okay? And that's during the tribulation. Why am I telling you this? All right? Because they already have it, like I said, already have it built. And in essence, it would go right here. Some people think that's where the original temple was. Okay? And you got the Dome of the Rock, and you got the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Anyways, the whole Temple Mount right now is controlled by the Muslims. Now here's the thing, in 1967, when they retook, after the 6-Day War, Jerusalem, they wanted to blow up the Dome of the Rock. All right? The people were sitting there going, blow it up. And the commander's like, I can't fight another war. So they didn't. And then they gave control over it back to the Muslims. So what you've got coming up is, in essence, there's going to be some type of peace agreement that comes out, that comes to here, because we know that there has to be a third temple during the tribulation period to fulfill Daniel's prophecy and Jesus' prophecy. Because Jesus said that no stone would stand upon each other for the current temple, but then also said that when you see the abomination of desecration in the temple, get out of 10. So, here's the rapture. All right, I'm going to. As you know, that what restrains him now, talking of the Antichrist, so that in his time he will be revealed. For the mystery of the lawless is already at work. Only he who now restrains will do so until he is taken out of the way. Okay. So, Paul is talking to the Thessalonians about the lawless one, the Antichrist. And basically, he's telling them the mystery that he will not be revealed until he that restrains him is taken out. What in the world does this have to do with the temple? Well, let's first look at the rapture. You've got a couple of different versions of what could happen with the rapture. Pre-trib, partial trib, mid-trib, post-trib. When the church is taken up. All right? I will tell you, I hold to a pre-trib rapture. And we're not going to really go there. But what I wanted to first tell you is there's a couple of different views. And it's okay to have any one of these views because the Bible is not dogmatic about it. It doesn't sit here and say this will happen, check. So we know it'll happen. The timing of it, I'll just tell you that I believe pre-trib. Now, why do I believe pre-trib? Because of this statement right here, that the lawless one is restrained.
Because once we've been raptured.
Now, let's talk about that. Now look at the temple and the Shekinah glory. So, the first temple, the Shekinah glory is taken up. Okay? Ezekiel tells that he sees the Shekinah glory going away, the temple's destroyed. They rebuild the second temple, Zerubbabel's temple, and then it's enhanced by Herod. The Messiah comes down. The Messiah is then taken back up to heaven, and who now is the temple? The church. Who is the restrainer of the evil one? The Holy Spirit, who lives within each of us. So when the Holy Spirit, the church, is taken out of this world, we no longer have the restraint. So the lawless one can take over. All right? That's where the peace agreement comes into play. And then what happens is, who comes down? Jesus comes down at the second coming, after the third temple's built, after the abomination of desolation, and after the tribulation period. The Son comes down, Messiah comes down, and then we get the fourth temple, which the Shekinah glory is then present at. Follow the temple, follow the Shekinah glory, and these next things start to make sense. The Shekinah glory leaves after all these kings that we're going to talk about, the civil wars that are going on next, in the next couple of elections. They go into exile, they come back, they build, Zerubbabel builds the temple, and Nehemiah builds the wall. Ezra basically builds the priesthood back up, and Esther saves everybody's lives. All right? We get the silent period, and Jesus comes down. The Messiah comes down. The Messiah comes down. The gospel is portrayed. It's taught. He goes back up. Now the temple is the church. The Shekinah glory is in the church. And when the church goes up, the devil comes down. We get the tribulation. And then we get the final temple, which is Ezekiel's temple. And that's the millennial temple, which Jesus will reign. If you believe in a true millennium, literal millennial, Jesus reigns in the final temple. And all of that started with this temple business.
I see what you're saying.
Here.
And Nathan, we want to ask you to do another class on this. Because
Oh, I know.
That one was too many years ago, and
Oh,
there's
yeah.
so much more to learn.
Give you an idea of the size comparison. So that's the tabernacle, that's Solomon's temple, that's Herod's temple, this is the millennial temple. That's a football field.
She didn't like Ezekiel's temple, I hear, we want it ornate like Solomon's.
Oh, it'll be,
More God.
Ezekiel's temple will be way different.
Glass floor.
It might be, who knows?
There you go, kiddies.
Very good, you covered a lot of stuff.
So,
But we have two next time to do.
so
two chapters.
next time, basically what we're gonna go through is the
Chapters in the Bible, if we want to read to catch up.
basically, that next week we're going to go through the rest of the kings and how the prophets interact with them. Okay? And then one change that I noted in your outline and is for some reason I had three chapters on the 14th. I'm not going to do 3 chapters. So what I did is I moved the return home up to with Daniel in the exile. Basically.
Oh, okay.
So you've got that. Notate that change.
Oh, I see. The
Okay.
7th, you'll have two. We'll have
Good
two.
job.
With all that was so freaking up here.
No, it's not.
All of the stuff, if you want to study it for yourself, the scriptures and are in those charts. Don't believe me. Read it for yourself.
No.